All right, welcome to another episode of the WP Crowd. Today we have our next installment of our Level Up series, Leveling Up as a WordPress Developer. I think this is episode 3 or 4 in our series. I have lost count, but it's been a pretty good series so far. Today we're talking about leveling up specifically when it comes to PHP, which is the language that runs WordPress or is behind WordPress. So it should be a good one. As usual, I'm going to start with introductions. Let's start on my left with Carl.
Hi, I'm Carl Alexander. I write a lot about PHP and object-oriented programming and WordPress on carlalexander.ca. I also speak at a lot of WordCamps. That's it.
Cool. Kris?
Kris Flanagan. I am a web developer turned pretty much focused on WordPress completely. PHP is definitely the language of choice for me right now, and now this past week, and since you're watching it in the future, I will have been presenting on leveling up in WordPress in Asheville this weekend. So, yeah, check that talk out if it's around.
And finally, Tom.
Hey everybody, what's up? My name's Tom McFarland. I blog daily at tommcfarland.com, where I press the keys until enough words come out to formulate sentences. I build custom solutions for clients using WordPress and out of my company Pressware, which you can find at pressware.co. And this is my first time on the WP Crowd, so Roy may be saying this is episode 3 or 4, and I am saying this is episode 0 or 1 for me.
I like it. And welcome, Tom, first time noob to the WP Crowd. We will be easy on you this time. So, continuing on our series, let's talk about PHP for a second. Before we get into some of the heavier stuff with PHP, I just want to point out that we've already talked about where to start kind of leveling up your whole game, and we've talked about building out a simple theme or a simple plugin, or using like a child theme to learn about some of the basic stuff that you can do while having something to kind of fall back to. So I'd highly recommend starting there. If you haven't started there, start there. Check out our first episode of the Level Up series. It'll help you with getting started. Our second episode was about asking questions on how to formulate good questions. So check that out if you hit a wall. So today we're going to focus on actually leveling up your PHP specifically. And there's many ways to go sorry, with PHP. And we're going to dive into a lot of that. But first, I'm just going to throw this out there. Let's say that you have built a few themes or a few plugins, and you're like, okay, what's next? So I'll just toss this to Carl first. What was your first step? Maybe I know that you kind of coded PHP before WordPress, but once you've gotten that base foundation, what was your next step after that kind of realization that you have now understood kind of the fundamentals?
I actually did start PHP with WordPress, but what ended up happening is really early on in my first WordPress project, I used BuddyPress, not the current version maintained by Triple J, but the older version. And right off the bat, I was building these kind of large websites or complicated projects with a lot of code, and there wasn't a lot of information out there around that to how to build applications with WordPress. And I just started looking a lot at what the rest of the PHP community was doing. And my first real big source of inspiration was the Doctrine project. So Doctrine's ORM, which stands for Object Relational Mapping, which for if you're mostly in the WordPress community, it's not a concept that's really useful or used, but it's basically an idea that you have an object and it maps to the database, and it handles it's a bit like WPDB, but much more complex. And that was kind of my starting point for learning. I started reading code. I say this in the previous episode, read code, so that's where I started reading PHP code. But that was kind of the path that I took initially to really kind of start diving deep into PHP.
So I have a question for Carl, but first I wanted to mention that along the same lines, when I first got into learning the basics of well, my first experience with PHP came with basically building really simple CRUD web apps, and I wasn't even using any ORM or anything like that. I was building they were very simple web apps in which you would have a application layer built in PHP that would talk to MySQL, and then you'd have a presentation layer in PHP. And these were really simple applications. And the reason I'm not naming any is because it was so long ago I don't remember them. But I remember shortly, well, a few years passed, and I got into .NET and Ruby on Rails around the same time. Ruby on Rails has Active Record, and there is a ORM there. And in a place I previously worked, they had built an ORM between .NET and then SQL Server. First, Carl, I'm curious. Well, actually, I'll say that like WPDB, I've never really thought about that as an ORM. I just see it as a way to sanitize data whenever you're writing direct WordPress or writing direct SQL queries. Maybe I should shift my thinking on that a little bit. But when I think of ORMs, I think of
it's just the closest thing in WordPress to kind of. It's not the whole thing. Like it's just one part. Like if I have to say specifically, it's like it's just a database layer.
Okay,
like,
I think that's a good definition.
By the ORM.
And I would say, so for people listening who aren't familiar, ORMs will normally take, if you can picture a database of rows and columns, an ORM will then take the data in a database and map it to a class or an object, and it will have attributes and it will have functions. So you can update an attribute, you can call save on the object and it'll write it to the database, things like that. Really advanced ones will do things like it might perform some type of sanitization, validation. It may know if there's a foreign key to another table, it'll know things like that. But my question for you, Carl, specifically with the experience you have with ORMs is, do you think WordPress would benefit from having one, or are we fine as we are with between WP Query and between the APIs for updating the meta table, the post table or the post object, things like that, the comments meta table, things like that? You think we're okay with those APIs?
Oh, sorry, I was trying to unclick the mute button. Honestly, I haven't really taught too much about that question in the recent year. I was definitely previously strongly in the camp of yes. I think it really depends. My previous agency work was very, very large database heavy projects, and WordPress really doesn't scale that well. Like I know that if I speak to an automatician, they'll say use custom post types. That's what you're supposed to do. You just build everything with custom post types. It'll be fine. But there's something, you lose so much of the magic of the database when you use that. You can't use you can't create joins, or you can create joins, but you can't create relationships between data, reference keys, things like that, that really ease kind of like the validation, how the data interacts with each other. And it's really hard to just model complex behavior in the database with just custom post types. So definitely if I had to go back to building, like if I had to build like WooCommerce or like even EDD, I'd probably be a bit miserable trying to do it with just what the tools that WordPress gives me, that I get naturally. But to be fair, like I've been working towards getting a bit of the groundwork towards that. Like last fall, I wrote an article called how to design a class to manage WordPress posts, and it was just about repositories. So like I started laying down a few little kind of crumbs, if you will, of what you can do without having a full-fledged ORM. But you can build, like, let's say, an interface, like a PHP interface, that you can use to just manipulate custom post types and then make it a bit more sane. So you actually have a class that represents actual business logic that has its own internal business logic, and then you just implement a small interface that'll do the negotiation between the WordPress database and your class. And already that, to me, makes the whole thing so much more saner, because now I have a class that I can use multiple times. I have another class that I can use to manage these objects that are from the database. But again, WordPress makes it hard because you always get an array back. When you get from you query WordPress, you always get an array back. You can't do the mapping aspect. You can only do the mapping aspect one direction. So you can use your object and map it to fields in the database, but it's very hard to get data from the database and map it to an object right now. But I'm confident those are problems that the WordPress community can solve. And if I was building something, I would definitely try to solve them, because to me they were super painful. When I worked in agency, they were deliverable projects. So I used Doctrine. Like, I did my first WordPress talk, and the only one I did for like 3 years before I started back again, was in 2010, and I was talking about using Doctrine with WordPress back in 2010. And to me, it was so much more enjoyable to do complex database operations with that. Sorry, I was going on and on.
No worries. Kris, how about you? Where did you start kind of after your initial, hey, I know WordPress, I can build themes, I can build plugins? Where was your first kind of next step after that?
You know, man, it took a real slap in the face for me to even want to level up, because I think I briefly talked about this in our last episode, but I was making fine money just being a web developer and writing hacky code. I got into WordPress and I found I could hack together anything I wanted in there. I built plugins and they worked. I didn't really understand security. I didn't understand a lot about the WordPress core, and I was just kind of making things work by just doing it as fast as I could and seeing results. But then I applied for a job with a real WordPress agency, and they loved me and took me to the next interview level and the next, and then they started reviewing my code, and they're like, this is so sloppy kind of stuff. You know, they're like, you know, apply again in the future. But it woke me up and made me realize I've been teaching myself to code. I've been teaching myself WordPress. I wasn't part of a community, and I built this huge project that showed you what beers are on tap around you, and I built it all in WordPress. But it was terrible. I actually had to take it offline just because it was getting traffic, just because it was built so badly. And then that's when I realized I need to figure out what I'm doing wrong and how to be better at it. I had Chris Wegman, who was possibly going to join us tonight, but his AC's out, so he's dying over in the next neighborhood. But he's kind of mentored me, and I think a mentor is a very good part of the leveling up process. You know, finding someone that's better than you that wants to help you get better. But just being involved with the community, and then really studying how other people wrote plugins and digging into their code and seeing you know, using objects more, because I was barely using objects when I was making my first plugins. And yeah, so I think that was a nice slap in the face, and then really digging into what other people are doing is a great first step to move into that next level.
So you mentioned objects, and again, we'll want to keep it not super low level, but kind of mid-level here. So maybe I'll throw it to any one of you who want to take this. But OOP, or Object-Oriented Programming, gets thrown around a lot as far as that term goes. And a lot of people say, you know, WordPress isn't OOP, like it's not object-oriented. So can one of you explain what, you know, OOP is and how it differs from what WordPress is, and you know, why it might be better or not better?
Someone can take this question better than me, but I just want to preface with this that when I was taking programming classes in college, they explained OOP in every programming class, like, imagine an object like a car or a toaster, and it has these methods and these properties, and in your head you're thinking, oh my god, this is so simple. This is an object that could do things and set things. But then when you start trying to implement it in code, it's very difficult, and a lot of people just are like, F that, man, and then just streamline their code. I feel like I've gotten better at OOP myself in the last couple of years, but we have a couple of brilliant people here I think could expand better than me on that.
I can take a stab at it. I'm sure Tom also has his opinion. I actually have a small email course specifically focused on object-oriented programming presented to WordPress developers. And Kris brought a super excellent point. So if you've actually done computer science, usually in college they'll just teach you Java or some other object-oriented language, and then they just come to you and they tell you object-oriented programming is the shit, you should use it, and then they have this really crappy example with the car or the dog and the cat and versus the animal, which I've used in the past embarrassingly, but and Kris is also super, like my first email that I send out for that course, I start talking about the mental way of thinking around objects, which I think is the hardest problem, and it's especially hard for WordPress developers because you already have a way to solve problems, and that specific way is called procedural programming, which is the easy way to see procedural programming is just to say, I need to get from point A to point B to build my solution. I'm going to go through these ordered set of steps. So I'm going to set this variable, if this and that. If this is true, I'm going to do this change, and then proceed to the end. And at the end, I'm going to have my result. Obviously, this still happens with object-oriented programming, but the larger thing that starts happening is that if I want to build, let's say, a plugin, I have to start thinking about objects. And objects, my favorite analogy, and I haven't found a better one, is Lego blocks. So really what you're designing is, let's say your whole plugin is your Lego contraption, and your objects are these Lego blocks that you can build. Like they're not even given to you. So you can build whatever Lego block that you want. You can say this one's going to be a 4x4, and then each object is one of these, each class is a type of Lego block, and each property of this class modifies that Lego block. So if, let's say it's a 4x4, well, you could say one's blue and one's red, and then assembling that together gives you your plugin. But just that mentality, this idea of breaking down problems into these Lego blocks is very, very hard, and they don't really teach you that very well at school either. At least I wasn't taught that way. Like I was just told very, not necessarily very standard ways, like this is the way you do things, you should do them this way too, and no creative process or design process or how these things should be done. And that's really where it gets hard for WordPress developers, because you already have a way to solve your problems. You're not at school and some guys, like some professor is just like telling you what you should be doing. You actually can build a plugin. You've built a plugin, and some guy is just going to come to you and say, like, no, what you're doing is not the right way. There's this better thing called object-oriented programming. They try it. They're like, no, this is painful and this sucks. Like, I'm going to go back to what's easy and I know. So that's really the big challenge around it. And I'm going on again, so I'll let somebody else take over.
I think that for object-oriented programming, so when it comes to WordPress, when it comes to programming in general, I am a fan of object-oriented programming, but I do not get into the typical developer religious arguments about it. Like if you're a fan of procedural programming, that's great. But I think that when you get into talking about JavaScript, I think it's important for people to understand that everything is an object and what that means. And I think that when you are getting into the realm of PHP and you're going to start talking about object-oriented programming, it's not enough to give those examples of an animal class or a car class or a toaster class, because no one's ever going to write a class that is going to be a toaster. I can't stand it when people give those kind of examples. I'm never going to make digital toast. But for whatever reason, what I feel like happens is that some of the most important and arguably the most powerful concepts of object-oriented programming are lost or they're neglected because people either throw in the towel too early or they aren't taken far enough into what object-oriented programming can do. And by that, I mean, sometimes you'll hear programmers talk about things like interfaces, and I'm not talking about user interfaces, but I'm talking about interfaces that will define what methods a class must provide. Okay, that's one very powerful feature. And if you have let's say you were to have a post class, or a post interface, and then under that post interface you have a number of different custom post types. You have posts, you have pages, you have you have something like notes, and they all inherit or they all implement the post interface, which means they're guaranteed to have those methods. Secondly, you get into the notion of abstract classes, in which you can have abstract methods, meaning that the method implementation doesn't, or it can be deferred into subclasses, and then you get into subclasses even further, where you then get into the topic of polymorphism. And it sounds like, oh, polymorphism, what is that? It sounds like a biology term. It's such a, programmers are really good at coming up with a ridiculous number of acronyms that you have to look up constantly to understand what it means, and then they come up with these really big words that sound complicated for, in my opinion, simple ideas. And polymorphism just means that, like, at runtime or when a program is executing, you might have an object declared of one type, but because when it was instantiated it was actually of another type or of a inherited type, it will behave that way. And when you're dealing with a lot of different things of the same family or the same type, like posts, then you can do some really cool things. And that really brings about a lot of flexibility. It brings about a lot of when you're during design time or development time or whatever it is you want to call it, it brings about a pretty significant amount of readability to your code. And it makes, in my opinion, it can make the code a bit smaller and a bit easier to read if your business logic is written correctly. And then to swing all the way back around to the initial question of, is WordPress object-oriented? I would say yes and no. I mean, you look in WordPress core, and there are classes. There are some God classes. There are some classes that are put together pretty well, and then there is some legacy code that it's not classes, or they aren't in classes. And sometimes classes are treated like namespaces, which is a topic for another podcast probably, where a class just ends up being a collection of methods that are easy to call or to classify. So WordPress is object-oriented in some ways, and it's not in some ways. I think that if you're interested in learning object-oriented programming, I think that it's not enough just to say, hey, a class is a blueprint for how something should behave. It's got its attributes, which are its adjectives, how it's described, and it's got its methods or its functions, which are its verbs, which are the things that it can do. That is not enough for object-oriented programming, because the next level is inheritance, and then there's polymorphism, and then, there's abstract classes, and there's polymorphism, and then I would even say design patterns after that. And I throw design patterns there at the end because some of them will wrap up all of the aforementioned ideas. Not all of them, but some of them. And right now, I'd say one of the most pervasive design patterns in WordPress is the singleton. I'm not going to go into detail really about any of that right now because it's kind of trailing. But anyway, I am a fan of object-oriented programming. I understand why some people aren't, but that is, I was going to say the short of it, but it's definitely not a short answer, but that is why I like object-oriented programming, and in my client work, that's why I tend to use it. It's just predicated on the fact that you have a clear understanding of the problem that you're trying to solve.
Yeah, I mean, I think you brought, I didn't want to interrupt you quite during the process, but during what you were saying. But one thing that stood out is like this idea of foundation within WordPress, and that's one of the things that I find, regardless that, like you said, I'm more of the opinion that it's towards the edge that it's not object-oriented programming. I would say, like, in most cases, there's not any sort of there's very minor interaction or combination of objects. They're just kind of there and to group functionality together. But one of the common complaints or comments that I received, and even Roy did that, I think, when we first met, he's like, okay, Carl, just write me an object-oriented plugin, like right now, and then I could show him one, but the amount of knowledge that you need to understand before you can get to the plugin aspect, like every topic that you've mentioned, I've written about. I've written about singletons, design patterns, a lot of design patterns like proxy, all related to WordPress, polymorphism, abstract classes, polymorphism interface. I've written about all of this, and at first it was very hard for me to present these articles because they're so, like, the knowledge is not very pragmatic, but they're so important for, like, now that I've written enough that I can just link them in the article, people can refer to them, and then we can build on that. And I'm only starting to get to a point, like after 30 or something articles, that I can start presenting a set of classes that are starting to interact together, because I've talked about the entire foundation behind it. And if WordPress was more object-oriented, I wouldn't have had to write as much to get everybody up to that point. And one of the first articles I ever wrote was about how core itself, WordPress core, should be a better teaching tool, like for developers. If like this entire series is about leveling up as a developer, and I keep saying you should read more code, and the first code base that a WordPress developer is going to have access to is WordPress. So it would be good if WordPress had a bit more objects, better abstraction, better interaction, so people understood these ideas, and they also had objects within WordPress that they could leverage within their own plugins, which is another topic in itself. But that's also makes it hard for somebody that's like Kris, who's like, I'm trying to do this object-oriented inside this plugin, and it's like, oh my God, this is like way harder than it should be. And most of my readers are at that point when you start. Like, I assume when you're starting off with object-oriented programming with WordPress that you're going to do this and you might just table flip and go, because it's so much. There's so much not there for you to understand and to do that it's so much easier to just go back to how things are done right now.
So there is actually something pretty good coming out of WordPress that is, I won't say like all the way object-oriented programming like Tom is saying, but it's pretty close, and that's the REST API. If you actually take a look at the REST API code, it's pretty on par with how you should be coding OOP, like what you should be looking at, and it's definitely a good example. Even their tutorial website, the v2.wpapi.org, I think it's wp/api.org, or -api.org, explains to you how you can extend basically the base class to make your own endpoints. And that is a very simple way of saying, all right, we have an object, a class, that does everything you need it to do for the API. Now extend it out and do what you want it to do for your new endpoint or your new functionality. And so it does a really good job of that. And I think that team, I would like to say I contributed more to that, but I've mainly just been following the GitHub issues and kind of yelling at them every so often. I'm a big user of it. Anyway, that team has done an amazing job with kind of injecting OOP into WordPress, and it's pretty awesome. And I think that it might be a good place for, as Carl said, people to kind of start looking as a learning place within the WordPress core or the WordPress code to look at how OOP is.
Ryan's a good developer. Ryan, Daniel are both very good developers. They obviously, we've talked about it. There was this discussion around Stack Overflow where WordPress was the least popular or second most least popular framework, or I forget, application to work with, and we were discussing most dreaded, yeah. And we just had a discussion around it, and he's obviously put some time and some thought in the design of the REST API.
They put a lot of energy into it, especially on their rebuild. So from V1 to V2, when they were kind of really pushing the feature plugin, the merge into core, it really did a big overhaul. I think that they could have gone farther. I think that there's probably some pushback from maybe some of the core team or some of the more influential people to make it more seamless into WordPress. But they've done an amazing job with it. So I'd highly recommend anyone who's just getting into OOP and wants to learn more. For a good WordPress example, if you know anything about the REST API, check out the code and check out the documentation, because it does actually show you how you can quickly extend out a class. And that's kind of like, once you learn how to create a class, that's the next thing, is you want to be able to create a class, which is, let's say, Carl's Lego brick, and be able to go, well, okay, maybe the class isn't a 4x4, but maybe the class is just the brick, and every time you extend it, you're telling it the dimension. So every new object from that base class is now defining out its own dimensions of 4x4 or 6x4, whatever it is you need, which is a much better way to look at it. Another real big thing I like about OOP is modularity, being able to add on or subtract away from functionality. One thing that we've talked a lot about in the past with WordPress itself, and it's come up quite a few times during WordCamp San Diego. It came up during Russell Aaron's kind of discussion, open discussion. We talked about modularizing WordPress in itself, and I think WordPress as a whole needs to be OOP to be able to get there. But being able to say, okay, users, right? Let's say you're building a website that doesn't need users, and Kris created a great plugin that kind of takes out the registration and the commenting, but that's additional functionality to something you don't need. So what if you could have WordPress without the users and without the commenting as just a base like module of a CMS? And I think OOP is kind of the way to get there. And generally speaking, I love the modularity that OOP gives you, because you can be able to, again, you can extend out from the base and then create new functionality very easily. And when you're working in a team, it's also very useful to be able to work on specific pieces of functionality kind of separated out. So let's say you have that users module, right? If it needs to be updated to be able to use something else, it can be done independently of the rest of WordPress or the rest of the website or the application. So that's another really big point to OOP, I think, that I love about it, and that's why I tend to code as much as I can with it, although I don't necessarily go that deep into abstract classes and polymorphism with my basic plugins. I tend to just make some classes, and they interact with each other a little bit, but not necessarily. I don't necessarily always create bases and abstract classes to work from, because kind of overkill sometimes.
I don't do it with every project. It just depends on how large the project is.
I think that's another thing, and maybe this is something that entry-level developers, as you guys are watching this, listening to this, whatever, don't assume just because Carl talks and Tom are talking about polymorphism that every single plugin that they even create, even if it does something super simple, is some weirdly abstract OOP project that has 15 classes. Sometimes procedural code.
This is actually how it is every time. No, I'm kidding. But I try to be quite frank. I don't want to sound disingenuous. It is often that way because often each plugin has a unique problem that if I bother to do the everything else, the 14 other classes around it that I've done a few other times in a few other plugins, that 15th one is a unique problem that I can try to solve, and that I can teach back too, right? So I think it's important, but it's obviously, we've discussed it many times, Roy. Like, there's a time trade-off, obviously, to those things, but somebody has to do it at least once, and then hopefully I share it back. Like, now that I've done so much of the groundwork, like I did a plugin for Jason at Postmatic, and it didn't take very long to do because I'd done so much of the groundwork already.
It is kind of ironic, though, that was a great point, Roy, where you're saying I built a plugin just to turn off the ability to register users and do comments because it's not modular enough where you can just not have that turned on in WordPress. And the funny thing is, I try to write all my plugins as class-based now. I have a little bit of a framework that I copy and then tweak to get things started. But since WordPress isn't modular enough to turn off a class like users, I built a plugin that's completely procedural because all it does is connect into like 8 hooks to turn off those hooks from doing anything. I don't know. There's just something ironic there, which is making me giggle inside. So, yeah.
Well, I suppose, I mean, like, you could have made it a nice object that I guess just hooks into that, and I guess almost every single hook could have called the same object, which did the same exact method, which is just return false. So it could have probably saved you a little time on that, but
they don't though. It's not, each hook has to be handled differently. Like, some of the hooks you return false, some of them hell, I don't even remember, I wrote it a few months ago, but they aren't all where you can just return false. It was so silly. Like, I did a lot of research on how comments are done and how users are registered and things like that, found all the different hooks that are involved, and yeah, you can't just return false. So I did kind of have to do this procedurally, just do this hook, now do this hook, now do this hook, this hook, this hook. It was really, it's pretty silly.
All right, well, unfortunately, that's about all the time we have. We actually had some more questions and things to go over, and Tom had a really good thing he wanted to talk about, so that's just letting us create another episode. So we will have another episode of PHP Round 2, Leveling Up Returns with a Vengeance. And we'll talk more about PHP and some of the more advanced stuff that we can get to past kind of the OOP stage, and probably come back into OOP and talk more about some of the stuff that Tom and Carl were talking about. I'd recommend pausing the episode after Tom talked last time and just Googling everything he said, because I did that with Carl when I first met him. I'm like, hang on, Google. And then that's how I learned a lot of my OOP, as well as him just looking at my code and yelling at me. It helped a lot. Carl, like Kris had a mentor of Kris, I had Carl. So yeah, good episode. I will see you guys next week, and stay tuned for another the next level up episode. Probably not next week, but in the next coming up weeks. Thank you again.